the Great Depression, where local communities, local governments issued their own money, but it had a negative interest rate, which liquidated the money after a year. So it was self-financing, terminating money, and a famous economist suggested the government should issue $1 trillion of this self-liquidating money in February the 17th, 1933, and the negative interest rate was paid for by buying stamps, putting on this money, and after a year, the government would have sold $1,040 billion worth of stamps. So it would have had quantitative easing for voters, which was self-liquidating and made a profit for the government, and would circulate much faster than the funny money that the government has.
That's a very interesting question. By the way, I'm Jim, not Joe. Yeah. No worries. 3 letters, starts with J, it's all the same. Okay. You have recalled that there was a lot of interesting innovation in the 30s to try and challenge the failure of the private banking system, and a lot of grassroots movements, including farmers and poor communities who recognized that private banking was a barrier to recovery, tried to imagine ways around it. So the whole social credit movement, for example, began in the 30s, which was this idea that currency as a means to exchange is something we could control ourselves. We don't need the private banks for it. So there's germs of good idea in those approaches. Same goes for some of these local alternative schemes that people try to develop, in community development, where you can have a local currency and then you use it to trade things with people who live in your neighborhood. And it's another way of trying to overcome the problem of cash constraints that limits people from working because there's nobody who can buy what they produce. It would be much better, though, to not have to rely on just sort of small operations like that, but to actually use the full power of the state to create a full-powered credit system. We don't have to, have just our own little alternative currency. We should be able to operate the formal monetary system in our interests instead of the way that it's working right now.
Would the formation or the promotion of credit unions help at all?
Credit unions, I think, can be part of the solution for sure. And credit unions, to some extent, have the power to create money through their loans, and they're doing it for a different motive. They are not interested in profit maximization alone. On the other hand, because credit unions tend to be small and they operate mostly at the retail phase of the banking system, they don't have the same sort of central role, at least in a place like Australia. In places where the credit union system is more developed, like in Italy or Netherlands, they actually do operate like banks, and they operate with a social mandate. They operate according to one member, one vote, rather than just maximize profit. So I think credit unions can be an important part of the solution.
I guess for me, I don't have a lot of faith in creation of new institutions within the current system of capitalism. And so I think that in a way, there are certainly some credit unions out there or other financial institutions which might treat people a little bit better. But I think fundamentally the problem is capitalism. And until we change the economic mode of production, we won't get and deal with some of these central problems in capitalism. For example, if you take a lot of these really tricky speculative devices that have been created over the years, derivatives and so on, and the trends towards pricing and people betting on things like the assassination of government leaders, all these sorts of things have occurred in a way. Financialization, people talk about the greater percentage of the economy that has been accounted for by financial institutions. That trend has skyrocketed in the last few decades, in part because the real economy of capitalism, the so-called real economy, has become far less profitable. So lower profit rates in the real economy have driven investors to putting their money into financial markets and investing in the financial sector, which in turn has contributed to some of the instability that we've seen. And so I think every time I always try to come back to the underlying sickness at the heart of capitalism as a system which has created this crisis of profitability, and which in the end we have to do something about. Because I think if you think about climate change as the number one threat into the future of civilization and the human race, whatever you want to call it. My feeling is that we won't be able to deal with climate change unless we deal with capitalism first. Because capitalism is a system fundamentally based on avarice, on greed, on profits at whatever social cost. Competition between large corporations to exploit as much resources as they can. Unless we get rid of that economic system, we won't be able to deal with climate change. And a lot of people will say, well, you're being utopian in the near future, you won't see that sort of revolution, or you won't see a global transcendence of capitalism. But I actually think that it is more utopian to believe that we can deal with climate change without overthrowing the system of capitalism.
An extension to what the last speaker just said, one question to do with Jim's talk regarding the psychology of the bankers and people at the very top, who seem to be driving a lot of this and pushing for this for the rest of society and the environment, so to speak. What are like a person's obviously driven by profits if they're in, say, the international banking sector, right? But one of the things that Jim mentioned was there's the side of fear and there's the side of what the other one? Greed, right? Clearly, greed at the moment is more influential. But fear, apart from failure, what are the driving forces that will force the characters in terms of the way they plan and they do things to actually go from a maximum profit sort of driven mindset to one which is actually inclusive and actually addresses issues as part of the intrinsic system rather than system as a for personal gain?
I think that I wouldn't wait for the bankers themselves to have a change of heart on those questions.
Yes.
I would instead think about ways to curtail the power and privilege that they have, to regulate their behavior and push it in other directions, and ultimately to replace them as the folks who determine how and when credit is created and what it will be allocated for.
I haven't really taken seriously psychology in terms of its impact on how different actors within the system behave. But I have become more sympathetic to psychology in part because of some research interest that I've had in issues to do with depression, for example, mental illness, which I think is, well, according to the World Health Organization, depression is going to be the #1 illness by the year 2030. And so I think psychology, mental illness, and so on is going to be a very important part of the future, rightly or wrongly. But I think in terms of the way corporations behave more broadly, not just bankers, but I think that they are fundamentally driven by competition. And so there's a passage in Karl Marx's Capital Volume 1 where he talks about how the individual capitalist is not driven by their self-greed, but by the need to compete with other capitalists. And that's what pushes them on. So if you take the big banks here in Australia, they have profits of around $27 billion or something within that region. Now, when they make, say, $6 billion profit themselves, they don't say, okay guys, we've had a great year, we've made $6 billion, let's take a break for a while, give everybody a few months off. You know? What they say is, no, let's get $7 billion next year. Because they're always thinking about who their competitor is and how they can make more next time. And it's the same with Nike, for example, infamous for its sweatshop wages. What drives Nike is not that they want to be mean to their workers, but what drives them is the need to beat Adidas and to beat all of the other sporting brands. And I think that competitive dynamic in capitalism is what creates a lot of these problems that we have, a lot of these really awful social consequences.
Currency has a basis in sovereignty, but the problem is the Federal Reserve and its clone, the European Central Bank, are actually private stock corporations held by these banks. And they lend money into existence. Therefore, the creation of money in these two big economies are actually controlled by private corporate interests. The implication here, and this is where the irony is, there are attempts that if there is a crisis in Australia, politicians would want to sequester people's hard-earned monies. I'm referring to the superannuation funds and deposits to stave off any crisis. But on the other hand, there are also attempts of private individuals to create their own currencies, their own cryptocurrencies. Do you think if there would be a revolution in the economy, the revolution would be somehow fought also on the financial markets?
Well, you mentioned the cryptocurrencies. That's kind of a bit of a fad at the moment with these bitcoins and other organizations that have tried to set up their alternative currencies, often associated with kind of a libertarian philosophy. I don't think those are going to amount to much in the long run, again, because the currency doesn't have any firm backing from a state behind it. So if they're faddish for a while, then they can become the target of speculative activity, and we saw that with bitcoins for a while. But I think as a replacement for the money that we know, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't agree that the U.S. and European central banks are not public institutions. There's issues about the charter of them and so on, but the government, they clearly respond to the government directives, and the governments appoint the leaders of those. I think of central banks as essentially public institutions and ones that we should try to reclaim and redirect. I do think that the financial system and debates over who controls it and how it's operated will be a focus for our activities demanding change, and that's why I believe strongly that we all need to learn a bit about the banking system and how it works and how it could be changed.
Good comments.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think what I always try to remember is that even in the financial institutions, which have obviously been the source of a lot of fascination and interest for people, partly because of the huge sums of wealth that they hold on to. But I think that often in the mass media, you get the impression that the banks and the markets work as if they're beyond human control. That it's just like a bad weather event, that there's been a turn on the market, it's just like a storm front has blown in. When in fact there are human beings involved in decisions that have impacts on these markets and which lead to these catastrophic outcomes. So I think that there are workers who work in the finance industry who can control some of these things, can use the power that they have at the point of production, and it's different a little bit, I suppose, in the financial sector than it would be in the manufacturing, for example. But nonetheless, I think that ordinary working people taking control of these institutions can start to make a difference. How we would organise production and allocation of pricing and all those sorts of things in the future are interesting, I think more speculative questions, but I think they have to be solved at some point in the future by people when we've wrested power out of the hands of the people who run these institutions, the bankers and the politicians and the financiers and the industrialists. So I think, again, coming back to this central problem, I think, which is at the heart of capitalism, a system that is deeply sick, but which is making ordinary working people pay the cost of the crisis that it is in.
My question concerns, I think it's called the basic income supplement, which a number of countries, certainly Finland has brought in, and a number of other countries are considering. The basic principle is that it would be a supplement for everybody to cover basic living costs, and then the idea is that if there's other things in life that you need, that you would still work to get income for that. So my question is whether any research has been done to show what kinds of impacts it's had for the economy and for standard of living and other measures like that, GDP and so on, since that was brought in, or is it still too early to know yet? And so are there any other studies being done into that?
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of that research. I'm sure there's some out there. I think my initial impression is to think that it's a good idea. I'm not too optimistic though about governments actually implementing it here in places like Australia. I know recently in Switzerland they voted not to introduce one, and I think if you look at what's happening here in Australia, it's an absolute scandal that the unemployment benefit is as low as it is, $250 per week, how people are expected to be able to live on that form of income when you've lost your job. Now, if you compare that to Sweden, for example, Sweden in your initial period after losing your job, your unemployment benefit is 90% of your most recent pay packet. Now, it goes down steadily over time, but it's still far more generous. And I think that there are different comparisons about how Australia's unemployment benefit compares to the rest of the world, but by any standards, ours is extraordinarily stingy. And I think there have been some analyses of the housing affordability for people who are on unemployment benefits, and I think about 1% of housing in Sydney is affordable for people who are on unemployment benefits. And I think, again, this is something which is not going to be discussed in this election campaign, precisely, I think, because the idea of paying somebody who doesn't do any so-called productive work is anathema to capitalism and the so-called work incentive. If you raise the dole payment, people will stop working and they'll take the dole payment. Now, it's ludicrous and absurd in many respects, but the idea of paying somebody who doesn't do so-called productive work does run counter to the very bases of capitalism as a system, which is based on the idea that you work or you starve. It's as simple as that. There's no room for sentiment, there's no room for charity. If you don't have the skills that an employer wants to use and pay your wage for it, you could end up homeless on the streets. And that's going to be the reality, I think, for a lot of people increasingly in cities like Sydney. It is a frightening prospect. If you lose your job in Sydney, you can very easily end up on the streets. And then once you end up on the streets, you can end up mentally ill very quickly. And it's very hard to get off the streets after that. And so I think it's a really big issue. And I think I'm supportive of the ideas that are coming out of different parts of the world, but I'm not terribly optimistic about it happening here in the near future. But I think it's something we should be fighting about, the issue of the unemployment benefit at the very least.
Yeah, I think you're talking about the fact that we need a good war capitalism to sort of charge its recovery engines, but I think with our current environmental crises, which are only going to get worse, so they'll more than fill the coffers, so to speak, in terms of needs. So unfortunately, but I just wanted to ask you in terms of the level of debt within the world, which is something that I don't think many people really sort of think about very deeply. I mean, we've had this pump priming of ridiculous levels both in Europe and America. Now Japan looks like it's going to go through another round. In fact, and we also have negative interest rates, which is another mechanism for pump priming, in effect, of pumping money in the economy. So the level of debt, in terms of particularly things like derivatives, which is obviously part of the problem with the global financial crisis.
What's your question?
Yeah. So I'm just getting a bit distracted by the mic, But yeah, my question basically is, what is the level of debt, and particularly the level of derivative debt, and how will that affect the ability of governments to actually, if there is a secondary crisis of 2.0, to actually then fill the gap of private capital, which will obviously retreat, to actually sort of pay for things like infrastructure, education, all the basic services. I think that it's going to be catastrophic personally, because I think there's so much more debt out there that's been hidden. And a lot of this money that's been pump primed, I suspect, has ended up in corporations and wealthy individuals' pockets rather than ending up in the real economy. So I just want to get a comment on that.
It is an irony of the reliance on the credit money system that the economy, in a way, does become addicted to debt. If this is the source of purchasing power that drives demand and therefore allows the economy to keep growing, then the debt has to keep growing in order to continue within the rules of the system today to facilitate spending and activity and job creation. Particularly tying it into something Ashley talked about before, the deteriorating dynamism of private investment in the global economy. Normally, under capitalism, you expect business investment to be leading the process of growth, because companies try to invest and accumulate and expand their share of the market. But in recent decades, that business investment has been shrinking in vitality, and that means there isn't much left to pick up the slack. We could imagine a positive way to pick up the slack by looking to the expansion of public services and public infrastructure investment and attacking the environmental problems that you mentioned. We could declare a war on climate change and get the same economic benefits as we did, in the 30s by declaring an actual war. But that would require political leadership and vision on the part of our governments. There is an enormous amount of debt. I don't know if anyone's even tried to add up the number for the total debt that's out there. But remember, it can disappear as magically as it was created. And the only reason it will hold us back is if we think it means anything. Once all those derivatives collapse, we should just say, well, that was nice. They were worthless anyways. And it should never stop us from demanding that our governments put real resources to work, not imaginary credit and financial assets, but real people doing real jobs, producing real goods and services, put them to work to meet the needs of our society. That will be the answer to the next financial crisis.
Exactly. Well said. Well said.
Yeah, I think obviously debt is a major part of the current predicament in the global economy. And obviously debt was a very big part of the beginnings of the most recent crash, with the inability of people to pay back their home loans in the United States before it spread around the rest of the world. Now, the fact that interest rates are so low in countries like Australia means that they don't have that tool at their disposal to use to try to get Australia out of a mess if there were to be one, because interest rates are so low, they can't really go much lower, so they can't use it. And the other side effect of it, of course, is its contribution to the housing bubble. The very low interest rates have helped to fuel this bubble. And so again, to echo what Jim is saying, debt is a huge problem, and it's going to be a major factor in the very next crisis when it does happen. But I think it's always interesting to note how the politicians talk about the need to get the budget surplus back, and how it's based on, they say every household around the nation knows that you have to be able to live within your means. But the reality is everybody is in debt.
Yeah.
And if the households are in debt, why not the government be in debt as well? But of course, we also know that it would be relatively easy to get the budget back into surplus if you think that it is important. It is relatively easy to get it back into surplus if you start making the corporations pay their taxes, and you clamp down on some of those tax havens, and you stop all those loopholes and all that sort of thing. So there is a problem, and there is a solution to it, but for political, economic reasons, the major parties are not talking about how they might be able to solve it, other than through cutting back on social spending and reining in some of these benefits that we've come to expect from the welfare state.
Excellent.